Christian parenting.
This is Cynthia Yanoff, and you're listening to Pardon the Mess. Each week we have honest discussions about the ups and downs of parenting and the lessons God is teaching us along the way. It's real, it's fun, and it's biblical. Life is messy. Don't walk the parenting road alone. Hey guys, welcome to Pardon the Mess. I am glad you're with us today. We have one of our very favorites back, Dr. Ken Wilgus. He's a licensed psychologist who specializes in the treatment of adolescents, and he speaks into all things related to kids and parenting our kids, and he comes from the perspective as a strong believer, and I'm so thankful that he loves the Lord and he speaks biblically as well. And so we are going to talk about things that crop up in the summer with our kids, including lazy kids and video games, social media, and friendships and social interaction when it comes to our kids and their friendships. So I know he has a good word that we need to hear in my house. I believe that will be the case for you as well, and your parenting and your kids. And so here we go with Dr. Ken Wilgus. Hey, Ken Wilgus, welcome back again to Pardon the Mess. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks, Cynthia. Glad to be here.
Well, happy summer. Big plans for the summer?
Yeah, a lot of family stuff going on. Kids moving, grandkids being born. So, yep, plans made without my consent, but I'm happy to be a part of them.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I'm glad you're here because it's summer, and gosh, we love our kids and we look forward to summer. And I don't know, I think I'm like most parents, and like come March, I'm like, here we go. This is going to be the summer of all summers. And I get it all planned up. And then it's like the third week of June. I'm like, dang, these kids are terrible. Somebody should have.
They're ruining my plans.
They're ruining my plans, and their dad should have disciplined them better because they're really heinous. And so I'm just glad to get to chat with you about it. And I think there's a couple of things that come to mind as a parent, or at least in my house with my three, that in the summer, things that I like to think about and talk about and work on. And some of those are spiritual, but on a less spiritual note, I like to talk out our kids, and I think through the whole lazy aspect and how, oh my gosh, they don't do anything. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about video games, and if we can get to it, maybe just cultivating friendships and what that looks like. So that's where we're headed. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So let's talk lazy kids. And I have heard you talk about this. Again, I always want to promote your podcast, and so it's Feeding the Mouths That Bite You. And I've heard you talk about this on your podcast as well. So everybody check out his podcast if you're not already listening. But I think for so many of us as moms that we like to run a tight ship, maybe we're driven ourselves. And so we have trouble maybe slowing down or resting. And sometimes that may be something that could feed into us thinking we have lazy kids, or maybe straight up our kids are lazy. I don't know. But how do we approach this well?
Okay, you would start with what is always my preaching gospel, which is depends on lazy children or lazy teenagers. And how you think about it and how you approach it is not the same thing. So if this kid is 12 and under, then lazy, which by the way, I wouldn't be surprised by lazy at any age. I mean, we always hope for that moderately anxious kid that always, wants to keep things in order and just does what you say if you just look at him sideways and all that stuff. But
yeah,
short of having this obsessive compulsive neurotic kid, most kids will go through basically doing what they have to do and no more. So for children, a big part of, if you have lazy children, it's very possibly that you are not structuring things like you probably should and could be structuring. And lazy children that don't want to get up and do today's chores or don't want to join that team activity that you're requiring, then they just get disciplined if they don't do it. Like if you don't do that, you're certainly not going to be playing your games, things like that. So you want to be active in simply basically teaching them how to structure their activity. Teenagers, however, after 13, very different ball game. Now these are very young, immature adults, and how to influence them is very different. And that still requires a certain amount of structuring, but you want to start talking about what their own goals are. Are you cool with spending all day, like yesterday, you were on your games for 6 hours? Is that really okay with you? And start to really try to work on their own insight and their goals for themselves. Then that's what you do a lot more with teenagers, so that you're increasingly letting go of your control and giving them the chance to structure their own time. And that goes, and this is the whole feeding the mouth that bites you thing, but that goes increasingly as they get older. So you give more and more freedom to try to let them structure their own time while hopefully maintaining enough communication to really talk to them about, what are you going to do in real life? You're not going to get a girlfriend like this, that, right? And, just being able to actually hopefully bring them more into adult conversation about how they structure their time.
Yeah, yeah. And so is there an element of it sometimes where it's more of an indictment on us as parents versus on the child? Like maybe sometimes as a parent, do we need to like settle down? I mean, you see people all day in practice. I mean, I think especially with teenagers, isn't there naturally physiologically this inclination towards rest and maybe being a little lower key?
Yes, that varies from parent to parent. If you have the super type A parent that just has these expectations that everyone around me should be type A, then yeah, that's not really paying attention. That's kind of lazy parenting to just assume that my child should be the same way that I am or how I want her to be, and just kind of try to argue your way into making them into something that they're not. What I should mention is that when we're talking about lazy, the most common attribute of lazy happens when parents are talking about how their children approach school. And I really want to separate that out. Laziness regarding school is a tricky deal because absolutely, there is just plain laziness. I don't want to do my schoolwork. However, B, there are some very common learning issues that look exactly like lazy. And if you simply assume that this kid, for example, who did quite well through sixth grade and then increasingly got worse and worse, doesn't turn things in, and now he's a junior, and you're sitting in my office saying, he just never really realized that you got to work to get grades. That's not possible. He's been in trouble from September to May for the last 3 years. That is not possible. That's simply lazy. So that's also a form of lazy parenting. If you're going to think about your child as lazy, mostly around school, then I would strongly encourage you, especially by adolescents, to start thinking about, is this something more than just laziness? Because that's where lazy mostly comes up, is around school. There is definitely laziness, but there can be much more involved in that. It's not that simple.
Yeah, yeah. I think I heard you say that oftentimes that ADD or ADHD can be masked as lazy. Speak into that a little bit, if you will.
Well, parents will say, no, he can't possibly have attention deficit. You should watch how many hours he plays a video game. Well, again, with attention problems, for example, you can always be drawn into something that is stimulating and rewarding. It's not that you can't focus on anything. It's that you don't have the executive function to control what you need to focus on as well as you need to, like being able to turn out the things that are not that are really distracting and not really what I need to be focusing on, and just kind of get yourself to focus on, frankly, boring stuff. School includes boring stuff that you need to still pay attention to. So, and there can be other aspects of that as well, like whether it's language deficit, slow processing speed, different learning things that mask and look simply like laziness. Like I say, if you've spent a long time in your house stressing the importance of academics, giving consequences if they're not doing what they need to be doing in school, that stuff, quote, basically should work. But if it's not working and you still assume that they just have a super lazy attitude, then you may need to definitely look at something else like a learning issue.
Okay. Okay. That's so helpful. And so let's stay with school for just a minute, even though we're talking summer, but I think this is important. I think it's a good time to think about it while we're on break and we have a little more bandwidth to consider this. But I think with school, and I hear this so often, and when I say I hear this, I'm probably means I've lived it and said it, but let's just say I hear people saying this, Ken.
Yeah. Asking for a friend.
Yeah. That, they're not living up to their potential. Like they're fully capable. They're not living up to their potential. All I'm trying to do is get them up to the level that they are naturally able to be at. What's wrong with that?
Again, what is, the story of Abraham and Isaac has always been super important to me because God required him to basically let go of literally the life of his son, but at the very least, any expectations that he had for this child. And that's, I think, archetypally true for all of us, that you really have to think about what is the true potential that this child has, that God has given for them, versus the potential that I pretty much assume this child has. And, I think there was a book a while back, or an article that was said, whatever happened to the C student? No kid that comes to see me, no parent brings their kid and says, he's basically a BC student. They're always secretly valedictorian, but they're just not working up to their potential. And that simply cannot be true of every kid, especially, and this is a bit of a pet peeve, how often this basically means academics, that their potential is excellent grades, which of course should lead to an excellent college, which leads to an excellent job. And we know that pathway doesn't always work. It's certainly not part of our faith. So expectations, you really have to examine, do you mean your own personal expectations, that if I parent and in this excellent job I'm doing, I will and deserve these super high functioning children, or expectations that are really paying attention to this child's temperament, this child's skills and abilities? And some children are, God forbid, average. What's so bad about that? They may have a pretty decent amount of energy to do the things they need to do, but they're not super driven to do all kinds of other things. I'm not quite sure why that's such a bad thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I was thinking of a friend I have whose son has not particularly done well in school by whatever standards we would all probably call doing well, has kind of struggled in school. But this kid has this Instagram account on the side, and this kid can sell everything in creation. Well, he's such an entrepreneur. He also has learned how to edit and do all these podcasts, all these different things on podcasts. He makes money editing people's podcasts. He's hitting it out of the ballpark in different areas. But and to my friend's credit, they have been really good at recognizing school's just not really his thing. We're going to get him through, and we're still going to send him to college, or he is in college right now. But how important is it also, and this probably is obvious, but to recognize that excellence doesn't have to look like excellence within an academic setting, that your kid can be living it elsewhere.
Yeah, it's very true. And it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, only because in the area that my practice is, that's just a huge pressure academically. And that's a great example where sometimes kids that are considered, quote, lazy are in fact, quote, wasting their time on things that if you pay attention, you'll see that there's gifting there. I remember my poor brother who just wasted all this time doodling and drawing, and, it just drove my mother crazy because he was just an average student. He now owns his own, he's a part owner of an advertising agency. He's the successful one in our family, doing quite well, thank you. Turns out his piddling around was a gift that is done very well. And he was not, in fact, as lazy as one would think from an academic perspective. So again, I think that gets back to a kind of lazy parenting if you're not careful, which is to really, you need to really pay attention to this child's temperament and their interests, and really assess, is this actually laziness that I'm seeing? Now, that's going to be different when we get to the topic of video games, but it's still, is something to consider. Is what I'm seeing actually laziness?
Yeah, yeah. I loved what you said on your podcast when you were talking on a similar topic, and you said, scripturally speaking, whatever happened to the greatest of these is love, and we've turned it to the greatest of these is living at your potential.
Valedictorian.
Excellence. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
If Jesus meant that as a thing, he forgot to mention it even once. It's not a thing.
Yeah, that's just it's a good thought, I think, for all of us. Okay, so going back for just a minute before we move on from lazy kids, let's go back to summer for just a minute. And so obviously we need to set reasonable expectations, I think, for our kids. Like you said, if they're younger, especially, we put it in place. Consequences help us not to be nags. And I mean, if there's anything I think I'm really qualified at as a parent, I think that I'm a very good nagger. And so talk to us about that. Not helpful. What do we need to do better? Do we just set consequences and stick to them? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you really, to keep your kids doing what they need to do, number one in the summer is, most parents know that they need to try to structure their kids' time. But a lot of the parents I work with actually overdo it. They really try to, we've got 2 camps and a sport going, and it just kind of makes the whole house go at 110 miles an hour and nobody enjoys themselves. So what I mean by structuring is to have definitely some structured activity and time, structured place to be where you don't have to be doing anything. So you have some structure, but also some real free time. And the way to do that is to set those things and put them down for children in stone. This is what we're going to be doing, and set those activities, but also set the downtimes when at this time we're not doing anything. And by the way, not doing anything definitely need to include times where everyone's screens go away. We're going to be doing, dinner. So everyone put their screens away. This is part of resting. That will be difficult with teenagers. And again, if you follow the feeding the mouth kind of philosophy, older teenagers, you do less requiring of that with children than you do with children and younger teenagers. But you still want to schedule, if you will, downtime so that things are not, in fact, scheduled all the time. But when you have it set, then you need to always, avoid being a nag, you need to be kind and pretty sincere about if you don't do this, then this will happen. When you don't want it to be, if you don't do this, I'm going to tell you again, and then I'll tell you again louder. And like parents of younger children, in my opinion, do way too much of, which is, if you don't do what I tell you, I'm going to get on my knees in front of you and give you a long explanation again of why this is so important. And it's just nauseating. You need to have a reasonable consequence. In my house, it was big for our little kids. It was big on, you go to your room. You know, if you're not going to participate in this, then you need to go do in your room for 10 minutes. And we didn't even make a big production out of it. The best thing when a kid is acting up is for you to for them to almost as close as you can disappear from the environment into a quiet place where they're not enjoying themselves. And then you can come back. But you do that without getting all upset, without a big speech. But that, if you mean that kind of consequences, that's how you avoid being a nag.
Yeah.
You just, boom, you do the thing you said you're going to do. If you don't follow the directions, then there you go. And they know you mean it. That way you can say fewer words in a quiet tone, and they know that something is likely to happen.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so wrapping up this little portion of lazy kids, it made me think of something someone said on this podcast a long time ago, and I can't remember who it is. And so I apologize to whomever said this, but they said rules without relationship ends up being rebellion. And so it just makes me think, as we look into summer, just working on relationship with our kids. And I think sometimes we get caught up in this lazy, or we're looking more at their actions versus their attitude. And I know in my house, I'm watching attitude, I'm watching character much more so than maybe always whether they're up and at 'em and doing their best potential. And so I would I think, challenge all of us this summer to really focus on relationship with our kids versus rules, or versus all of the things the task-oriented things we have for them. So those are my 2 cents, but what do I know? I'm not the expert, Ken.
No, you are semi-pro. And I would only add that, especially coming out of the stress of a pandemic, it's even more important to be cautious and careful about our relationships and being loving, because it's just so easy for all of us to reach our boiling point and kind of feel almost justified in going over the top. And we really have to be careful in how much we expect of ourselves and others during this time.
Yeah, that's good. Hey guys, jumping in here today to remind you that pre-order is now available for our 2021-2022 prayer journal. It is called Joyful, Patient, and Faithful, and it's based on that Romans 12:12 scripture, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. And that's exactly what we're going to do, is be faithful in prayer over our kids. And so we will start, as you know, in September. Every Monday morning, we will be kicking off a podcast praying over our kids, and we follow through this prayer journal, and it's just praying attributes of God over our kids. It is praying that our kids know Him, praying scripture over them. And so I would love for you to grab a copy with this pre-order. Go to cpprayer.org. Again, cpprayer.org to get your copy. I also want to thank Faithful Counseling for sponsoring our podcast today. If you have not already, you need to go and check out Faithful Counseling, because it's the perfect solution for people seeking traditional mental health counseling who prefer a Christian perspective. They assess your needs and match you with your own licensed professional therapist, and it's done securely online. The service is available worldwide, and you can log onto your account anytime to send a message to your counselor. You'll get timely and thoughtful responses. You can also schedule weekly video or phone sessions, and you don't have to sit in an uncomfortable waiting room. Faithful Counseling has great therapeutic matches, but they make it easy and free to change counselors if you need to. It's more affordable than traditional offline counseling, and financial aid is available. Start living a happier life today. Check out Faithful Counseling. Go to getfaithful.com/pardonthemess. Again, getfaithful.com/pardonthemess, and you'll get 10% off your first month. Okay, let's talk video games. And I think maybe we just lump screens in a little bit as you feel like you want to speak into that as well. But video games. And so I don't know if this is true in every house. In my house, it's more my middle school son. My teenage daughter's less interested. But my middle school son is all in. And so I'm just curious on your thoughts on, first of all, the ratings on them, because do we abide by them? And I know that sounds silly, but I think if all of us look closely, some of our kids are playing games that have some pretty significant ratings, like Call of Duty, some of those. And so just questions on that. Are all games equal? And what about ratings? That kind of thing.
Well, the ratings are a self-system, so it's kind of a joke. It is a kind of an attempt to display that video game companies are trying to be responsible. I think with teenagers, ratings make some difference because with teenagers, you're always negotiating their relationship to the world as it is. So it's very hard to tell a 14 or 15-year-old that I don't care what that's rated. I'm telling you it is immoral. That, you can tell an 8-year-old that, and that might make some difference. But once they're getting older, a teenager isn't taking your word for it. They're thinking, well, the rest of the world doesn't agree with you. And so you have to kind of take it seriously in that regard. But I think more clearly, the way to think about video games is, number one, as you mentioned, the first thing to think about is just screens. Then you think about the content. So the amount of time on screens is more and more research is continually showing is in itself damaging. And you really need to be cautious. We need to. I mean, I'm looking at you right now on a screen. So there is usefulness in screen, and there is just what seems useful that just isn't. And all of us, literally adults and teenagers and children, need to really be evaluating the amount of time spent on a screen. Then secondly, the content of that screen time obviously is important. And some of the two big ones is social media for girls, teenage girls, and video games for boys. Those tend to be the biggest issues. Just try to take a video game away from your teenage son, and you can see how big a deal it is. It's similar to telling your teenage daughter that she's now off of her social media. It's like cutting off oxygen. So the content of those things are what really needs to be monitored as well. And you kind of got to almost kind of have the confidence to know that while you're going to be talking to a teenager that will talk to you like you are out of your mind. I cannot believe you're keeping me to 2 hours of video games on a weekend. Oh, yes, absolutely. And 1 hour during the week on a weekday is plenty. But boy, you tell a teenage boy that, and it's like you've said, you need to stop breathing. And it's very similar to telling a teenage girl that, you need to stop all social media by, 9 p.m. You don't need to be on any of that. You would think you have just ended their life. So it's something, what makes it hard is that parents really kind of lose their resolve in that, because it gets pushed on over and over again, and their friends aren't having the same, at least the ones you hear about, don't have the same limits. So it's really important to be pretty clear about that. It's almost like an umpire that has to keep dusting off home base because it keeps getting, like, wow, I remember we said it was going to be this, and now we're letting you take it into your room. We didn't. Sorry, we're going to have to back that back up again. You have to almost kind of keep that limit. But then lastly, that's another reason why with teenagers, you need to have other aspects of their life that you are letting go of, that you are not under your thumb on everything. Things like whether their room is clean, whose friends they keep, what music they're listening to. These are things that you can and need to let go of so that you have more, kind of validity when you draw the important lines, including those lines that are going to seem like it's crazy to a teenager. Video games for boys, social media for girls.
So I like what you're saying is like, pick your hill to die on, and your hill to die on doesn't need to be the little the nagging things or whatever. Let's pick our hill and let it be something as significant as screens. When you mentioned though, those, that, like an hour a day during the weekday and 2 on the weekend. Is that like a for instance, or is that like I legit think that's what a solid time constraint should be?
That's actually I think the Pediatric Association's kind of general guidelines,
Okay.
that, and maybe summer you can maybe stretch to 2 hours per day, but that's, you don't have to. That's a lot. That is a lot. But again, parents who are listening right now are going, really? Are you kidding me? My kid will strangle me in the night if I do that. Well, again, you need to kind of do your best to back things up to normal and watch carefully how these things will drift, because they absolutely drift. And don't be surprised when your kid defies your rules, sneaks around and lies about it. Of course, not because they have huge character flaws, but a teenager will think you are crazy. And you'll just have to be firm enough to go, yeah, I'm crazy enough that since you didn't do it, like I told you, you're off tomorrow. You don't have any games tomorrow because you didn't follow the rule today. And you got to stay pretty firm about it. And yeah, back to what you said, pick your hill to die on. If you use all your ammo on lesser stuff, then you won't have anything that'll really hold you on the things you need to.
Yeah, yeah. And the importance, I think, we all know this, but just reiterating the importance of modeling this well. And although I do not struggle with video games, I haven't played COD ever. I want y'all to know that's what the cool kids are calling Call of Duty, for anyone who missed that. But nonetheless, yeah, I'm so cool. But recently I was on my kids, my older two, about their phone usage. Like they're in our family room and we're watching a show and they're watching their phone. And I'm like, what's going on in this world that we're double screening it? And so I'm like, all right, you know what we're going to do? Let's all pull out. This is a bad call, by the way. This was the OJ glove all over again, where you should have tried on the glove before the middle of the trial. Okay. I said, we're all pulling out our phones and we're going to look at the screen time to see how much screen time we've had this week. Because iPhones will tell you that. Hello, mine was the highest.
That was you gotta look. That was
too bad.
Yeah, you really need to check.
So let's all model that a little better than we did at the Anhoff house. Now I did blame it on work and a bunch of other things, but nobody bought it. Okay, one other thing on video games. So if my kid is playing violent video games. And by the way, I feel like in our house, we do a pretty good job of monitoring this. So before anyone sends their hate mail, we're not playing ultra violent games, but a lot of the games out there have a violent element. And I think there's all kinds of discrepancies between whether it's cartoonish or actual like figures and the blood and all this stuff. My husband's done a ton of research, but if my kid is playing some of these games that are very popular, that seem violent, are studies showing, or in your experience, am I raising a psychopath, or is it more likely that they're going to have violent tendencies? What does that look like?
Well, there's still a moderately loose connection between, strongly violent tendencies and violent video games. My experience has less to do with the video games themselves, which are not good. Don't get me wrong. There is a moderate connection between, especially with children, impulse control and violent video games. But my experience, especially with teenagers, is that you really want to think about video games more in terms of the amount of time spent on a video game versus the amount of time in real life. So if you have a kid that only does, say, an hour a day, but also has no other social connection, no real life, that's what I would worry about more than a kid that's doing a couple of hours, but then spends the next 4 to 5 hours in real life interaction with other real life human beings. As for the violent part, I'm all about, controlling all you can when they're children and even young adolescents. But you're going to find pretty quick by 14 that you're pushing against an ever increasing tide, and your ability to keep them from playing it versus the side effect of how controlled they feel begin to outweigh each other. And so in those cases, I think you pick the point by middle and late adolescence that you let them know, again, adolescents are young adults, so that you let them know that I strongly object to this, but you are now too old to be doing this just because I tell you. Now, if I catch your little sister looking at you playing this game, you are done. But I want you to use your own judgment about this, and it concerns me. That opens up an extremely important channel of communication that you just have to have with teenagers. And the most important communication is not, did you play the game? Did you play the game? I thought you didn't. You said the more important communication is, how can you still play that? I know you're a junior in high school and it's up to you now, but Does that not grieve you to even do that? Are you not worried? That's the kind of thing so many of the teenagers I work with never even really think about, because they're used to being talked to like children, and they're used to thinking like children. Like, is it naughty? Is it good? You're a young adult. What are you going to do when you have control over this yourself?
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. Okay. And so let's move into, and I think this naturally leads to kind of friends. I think that, and friendships and social interactions, I think that our kids think that they are having social interactions. I know that they do through video games or social media, not to pick on boys, or social media. And that, so when you say like, hey, let's get together with your friends, they're like, well, I've already been with my friends. Like, it kind of is getting replaced. And so as we're looking into summer, help us think through that, and not allowing that, and how do we cultivate friendships, that kind of thing.
I would like to take this opportunity to deliver a public service announcement.
Oh, I can't wait.
That I was concerned about teenagers' lack of real social interaction before the pandemic. And now I am just over the top concerned. It is a generation that almost doesn't really know what real social interaction looks like. If you try to tell a teenager who says, oh, I get with my friends every afternoon, and I'm like, that's great. Where do y'all meet? Well, we're playing Call of Duty. Oh, you mean just on a game? It's not really connected, not actually there. No teenager registers, well, good point, ever. They look at me like, well, what are you talking about? They're like, we are together. No, you're not. And I've literally sat with kids in my office going, see this is you, this is me. This is called 3-dimension, and we're actually together. On your video game, you're not. Still, they don't really even know what real interaction is, and it is extremely different kind of communication. The subtleties of communication, body language, physicalness is actually kind of being lost. And so my public service announcement is, please, as soon as you can, try to help your teenagers spend time together with other kids, spend real time in social interaction. And secondly, and I always talk about this, help your children and teenagers, especially, to identify who are your close friends, your 1 or 2 friends. Kids always talk to me now, even girls, about, oh, I've got 6 or 7 best friends. No, that means you have no best friends. You only have 1 or 2. I mean, the girl that you trust to tell anything to. Guys, of course, are way worse than that. They don't even know what I'm talking about. You have to encourage your children to think about the intimacy of their friendships. Who is the kid that you have his back and he has your back? Who is the girl that well, we had a fight and we don't talk anymore? No, that was your best friend. Go and talk to her, talk it out. So it's physical interaction you must encourage. And secondly, interaction with relationships that you teach even your teenagers to build that intimacy with your best friends. I mean, I have a best friend that goes back, goodness, I don't even want to say, 50 years now. Best friend. Like, we part of our best friendship is going through such boredom together. Just nothing happening. That's part of just, experiential intimacy. We were on that losing team together. Remember, all that stuff is being lost more and more in relationship intimacy. So physical connection and time together, that should be on everyone's list this summer. Get everyone over to your house, or get them over to somebody else's house, or meet at the park, but let's be physically together as quickly as possible, because there's a whole different pandemic people aren't taking note of, which is the pandemic of isolation.
Yeah. And I think as parents, we struggle because we feel like, I don't know who put this in place, but we feel like if our kids are having friends over or whatever, that we have to have some big plan, versus I love that you just said your friendships were kind of stemmed from boredom. Like, it's okay. We don't have to take them somewhere, spend $1 billion, or have the best house or the biggest swimming pool, or, 30 relay games planned. Like, let these people be.
So true. And so much boredom at church. No offense to my church, but we were there 3 times a week, and so much time doing nothing. And my wife was the same way. She didn't go to the same, she grew up in a different church, but just being there is, and you're exactly right. Activities planned, just go do something, figure something out.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So let's close with this as we wrap up, and we're talking summer. I'm going to just throw out the softball. Is there anything we're missing or anything we need to be thinking towards in knowing what you know and all the people that you work with and counsel? What needs to be on our radar? What needs to be significant this summer?
Well, other than sunscreen, you mean?
Yes. Thank you for that very practical note.
Yeah. I think I would only add that because we're coming out of this whole time of isolation, I think that it's also important, as they always say, you put the oxygen mask on you first before you do it to your kid. And, I don't really work with parents who aren't caring about their kids. All the parents I work with care so much, but there's a way to care in a way that's so intense that it doesn't do all that you're really trying to accomplish. So I would say to the parents for this summer that it's also hugely important that you take time for yourself and for your marriage. Your children that's not your whole being. God is not standing back with his fingers crossed, hoping you don't screw it up. It's really important to be at peace as much as you can. And that means real time, just to be quiet and alone. And if in your marriage, oh my goodness, definitely take time for just you and your spouse away from these kids. And this summer is really one of the first times we can do it. Don't overpack it in, because I got people who they have packed up their whole summer with all kinds of stuff. If you don't overdo it, but don't do everything just for those kids. Think about what you need for your own peace and presence of mind as a couple and as an individual.
Yeah. I remember hearing it said when my kids were little, I heard a bunch of people talking about, one of the best things we can do for our kids is just keep a strong marriage. And so good
it's
word.
So difficult.
Yeah, for sure. Easier said than done. But okay, good word on summer. Thank you, Dr. Ken, for being here as always.
Great to be here.
Everyone check out his podcast. I will make sure it is linked to our podcast notes and his book. It's also linked in our podcast notes. Always so much wisdom, and we'll hopefully see you again very soon.
Thanks.
All right. I love Ken Wilgus. He always has some really good, blunt, helpful information for us, and I'm very thankful for him. He speaks my language of being blunt and sarcastic, and it makes me laugh every time. So I hope it's spoken to you as we are doing summer with our kids. And for today's Messy Minute, I want to talk to you about friendships. And it's interesting because there's certain anchors, I like to call them, that my husband and I have kind of put in place in our parenting. And one of the anchors that's come to be over the years is in our house, we want there to be room at the table for everyone. And that includes our kids and their friendships. And it is, yes, so easy to kind of insulate them around the kids that like them, that we like the parents. But there's so many other kids out there as believers that we need to be speaking into, that we need to be loving well. And it makes me think of the greatest commandment where the Pharisee goes and asks Jesus, technically it's a lawyer, goes to Jesus and says, hey, what's the greatest commandment? Because there were so many of them. And he's trying to trick Jesus. And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. You see how he's saying that the greatest commandment is to love God, but he can't separate out the fact that we're to love our neighbor too. And the lawyer, it makes me laugh. He says, well, who's my neighbor, right? Like the most obvious question ever. I feel like my kids ask me those obvious questions every day. And the answer we know from the New Testament and from Jesus' teachings is our neighbor is everyone. And so I would just include everyone. I would say that there's a place at the table, there's room at the table for every single person. And yes, there may be people that are not the best influences for our kids, or there may be reasons for safety, other reasons that maybe we don't include people, but by and large, that is not the case. And so this summer, as we're making sure we're really conscientious with our kids and their social interactions, I would just say, let's include other kids. In our house, it looks like this. When my kids want to have a birthday party or invite friends over, when they give me the list of 10 or a couple of friends on Friday, I say, okay, invite someone that I haven't seen in this house in the last several months. Where's so-and-so been? Just reminding them to open that door, to invite other people, to include everyone and to love them well. We live in a world that wants us to love those who love us well, right? And a world that also likes to cancel out those that don't think like us, look like us, vote like us. And I just know as believers, we're called to more than that. So let me encourage you, join in on that anchor of making room for everyone at the table. And it's a great time to do it in the summer. Glad you're with us today. We know your days are busy, so as always, thank you for joining us as we pardon the mess.